Okay, so hi, how's everyone doing today? Good? Good food? Good time? All right. So one of the things, obviously Monday was the SSAs, right? Septiembre. What is that? Independence, right? Mexican independence, but it's not just Mexican independence because we're thinking about broader Latin American countries who are becoming independent. And so one of the things is that we have all these festivities that go on in Houston, right? You had all kind of people celebrating in different places, independent, but that wasn't by happenstance. That happens because in the 60s and 70s, people were really yearning for their history. And when they were yearning for their history, they were yearning to capture some of these things like these festivals. How does that tie into what I'm saying today? What I'm saying today is a subject that also is yet to really be, publicized, really be known about, and it is something else that people are yearning to know more about. So my title today is Uncovering the Fight for Race and Gender Freedom, Oral Histories, and Tejana Feminist Thought. So I want to spend a little bit about oral history to start with. First off, do people by show of hands know what oral history means? Okay, a couple of folks. What does oral history mean? Speaking the stories, right? So yes, at its core, it is sharing stories, right? And why does this matter? Well, part of this work is recovery because, as you can imagine, our archives are not well plenished, right? Like if you can think about all the different repositories, all the different libraries, they probably don't have a whole lot of information about Mexican Americans, Mexicans, Latinos more generally. So oral histories fill those gaps. They allow us to have a deeper awareness of what happened in these particular decades, in these moments of time. So, with that being said, I like to also argue that oral histories are also what you call testimonies or testimonials. Why? They provide a space for people to tell about their traumas, to tell what it was like to grow up in places like Houston, Texas, to talk about their struggles and their triumphs. Also, their collective history. So your personal story, for many of y'all, is not just your own story. It's a story of your grandparents, it's a story of your parents, it's a story you're going to pass on to your children. So these oral histories in many ways are the collective story making up your personal story. Thirdly, I like to argue that testimonials are also political statements, acting out, saying something about the society that you're in, being able to let other people know what you really feel. And of course, it has a lot to do with the interviewer, and I'll get to that in a minute. But it is a way to make political statements. So, with that being said, what did I use? What was my method in my research for oral histories? Well, I used this book. It's called The Oral History Method I Use is Women's Words, The Feminist Practice of Oral History. Why did I use this book? Why was it instrumental for me? Well, it's a series of articles, a series of writings, and the reason why it was instrumental to me because it talks a lot about considering multiple factors. One, considering where your person comes from, where they were born, what their life experience is, what their race is, what their gender is, what their class experience is. Secondly, it considers how you're sensitive to someone. Many of us in our society now, we're not used to active listening. But in many older societies and in many native societies, you had a way where it was like a talking circle. And literally, you could not talk until it was your turn to talk, which means you had to pay attention to what everybody else said before you could speak. So with that being said, part of the interview process is really deeply listening to the other person speaking, hearing what their feelings are, what their attitudes are, listening to the hidden speech, listening what they're saying and they're not saying. In addition to that, I like to think of oral history as a mutually beneficial process. Sometimes when we do oral histories, when we collect stories, it's for our gain. It's to help us to research something. It's to help us to publish something. But we got to think deeper about it. It's not just about taking from the community. It's also giving back. So how have I given back? In the past, people have asked me to do things for them, like whenever you publish an article, you need to send that to me if my voice is in it. My dissertation, I plan on sharing with all the people that I have, and I've shared it to some, but I'm going to share with the rest, to those that I interview, so that they can get their perspectives of what I'm writing about them. I can be open. The article that I worked with in this book, Chicana Movidas, it was about a very instrumental woman here in Houston, Texas, Maria Jimenez. Me and her daughter wrote it together. And Maria looked at every single draft of it and offered her opinion. Because once again, it's not just about taking, it's about that collaborative process. So, those are some things that I'd like to mention about oral histories. Now I'd like to get into the meat of my discussion, particularly coming to race and gender freedom. So, let me get into that. So, Juan Crow. What do people think about when I say the phrase Juan Crow? Jim Crow, right? Jim Crow, right? So what would be different if it's not Jim Crow, it's Juan Crow? Who would it be speaking about? Right, Hispanics or Latinos, right? So, Texas. Texas was a former Confederate state. Texas is part of the South. Texas has segregation on the law, in the books. It was for segregating white people and black people. But those same segregation codes apply to Mexican Americans. So, how do they apply? Well, one, if you can see in the sign, it says no dogs, no Negroes, no Mexicans allowed. These were signs that were in places like Dallas and other restaurants in and around Texas. Whenever Texas became part of the U.S., there was a significant Mexican population here. And for those that stayed, they were supposed to enjoy citizenship rights, but what they found out is oftentimes those rights were violated. So a lot of times they were kept in certain neighborhoods. They could only work certain jobs, usually the very lowest paying jobs. And they had very minimal education. There was actual schools called the Mexican School here throughout Texas, where Mexican kids would go. So why do I mention all this? The people who are part of the movement I'm going to discuss, they grew up at a time in the 70s and the 60s where this is still going on. So this is going to shape their worldview. There's a couple of other images I have there. One of it is called Colored Men, Hombres Aquí. Someone found this. It's actually from the Hernandez versus Texas case, which led to a whole other thing. That's a whole other topic. But the point is that the court was trying to say, no, everybody's treated equally, and then they had a sign in their courthouse saying, colored men, hombres aquí. In other words, if you're African American or Latino, you need to use this restroom. The other image I have up there is of Hidalgo Park. By show of hands, is anybody familiar at all with Hidalgo Park here in Houston? It's kind of far from here. I get it. Hidalgo Park is one of the historic neighborhoods, Magnolia. So it's a little way from here, I understand. But Hidalgo Park, guess what the name of that park used to be before they called it Hidalgo Park? The Mexican Park, you're right. It was called the Mexican Park. Why? That's where the Mexican kids could play. Mason Park, which was a mile away, was white only. It's not anymore, but it used to be. So Mexicans could not play at that Mason Park. They had to go to Hidalgo Park. Once again, this is what's shaping people. And this is kind of related to a talk y'all had last year, but people have documented all of this, one of which is The Injustice Never Leaves You, which is a great book about not only the anti-Mexican violence that's happened in the borderlands, but also particularly how people remember those things and continue on and have those stories for their children so their children never forget. So, getting into the women who were involved, we have a standard narrative. There's a standard narrative out there about what women did in the 60s and 70s when they were part of this movement. There was a major conference that kind of kicked off a lot of this activity, and it's called the 1969 Crusade for Justice, which was the organization, National Youth Liberation Conference. It happened in Denver, Colorado. There was a lot of people who came. Women at that conference said, quote, "It is the consensus of the group that the Chicana woman does not want to be liberated." Why would women say that? That's the question, right? Why would women say this? Well, if we dig a little bit deeper, we can see that women were concerned about issues in their community. In the workshops, women said they advocated for the changing the concept of the alienated family to where women assumes total responsibility of the care of the home and the raising of the children, to the concept of la raza as a united family, where men and women assume the responsibility for the love, care, education, and orientation of all children of Aztlán. Women also said, "We have reached a point in our struggle for liberation of la raza where the growth of our women and their participation has become utmost necessary." Lastly, a person who participated in the workshop said that that this was a simplified statement, the consensus of the group that the Chicana woman does not need to be liberated. She said it's a simplification, but, quote, "When a family is involved in a human movement, there's little room for women's liberation alone." That's the point. The statement that these women were making was that they were not going to just fight for women's equality by themselves as women. They're going to fight for it within the broader struggle of their community. They were not going to disassociate the two things. And in particular, you really see that happening in Texas. But because we have this standard narrative of thinking that one statement I mentioned at the beginning is the only thing that was ever said, people think that, well, there were loyalists to the movement who were loyal, and they remained and they didn't address women's issues, and then there were the feminists who left. And that's just not real. That's not what happened, particularly in Texas. So, what did happen in Texas? Well, a lot of people in Texas created what I call community feminism. What do I mean by that? Community feminism is basically having a commitment to both racial and gender liberation. They're going to fight against racism and against sexism. This concept comes from somebody else, Ula Taylor. She was thinking about how African American women were engaged in these activities. And this kind of typifies what they did. The two major organizations at the time, who are the two major organizations in Texas, Adrian, for the Chicano movement? Yep, 60s and 70s. Yep, the Raza Unida Party was one of them, a third party. LULAC to a degree, but for the youth in particular, it was the Mexican American Youth Organization. So the two major statewide organizations were the Mexican American Youth Organization and the Raza Unida Party. And these were the two major organizations that women were involved in and really shaped. So how did women construct their sense of what feminism looked like? How did they come to that? Well, they came to that through this, what are called counterpublics or autonomous zones. Now you're like, what is that? That sounds, uber theoretical. What exactly is that? It's just basically the idea that women in conference spaces and organizational spaces and spaces where only women came together, they were able to talk about their issues and decide what was important to them. That's what the idea of the autonomous zone. They're being autonomous. They're not necessarily meeting with they do have spaces where they meet with the guys and they talk about these things, but they have their own spaces as well. And in those own spaces, they're able to shape their vision of what feminism looks like. So, these women's spaces allowed Tejanas to identify and strengthen community feminism, or this idea of anti-racism and anti-sexism. And in particular, they were really looking for the principles of sexual freedom, reproductive justice, race liberation, and intergenerational and multi-directional women's empowerment. We really see this in a very well-known conference. It's gotten a lot of coverage, but I would argue not always in the fullest way. And that's the 1971 La Conferencia de Mujeres por la Raza, or the Conference for the Women of the Race, or the Women of the People. Because the raza back then just meant people. So, what was this conference? Well, if you can see it, it says Houston, Texas. And it was a major conference at the YWCA in Magnolia Park in Texas, in Houston. 600 women, 600 Chicanas from across the nation came to this conference. It was a major deal. It was the first time documented that Chicanas came together in such a big way to talk about the issues that were important to them. Typically, once again, if we go back to the standard narrative, the narrative where we don't necessarily interview a whole lot of women and get their voices, the standard narrative is 150 women walked out on the last day, and when they did, they were making a statement that women's issues were not important to them and that they would only be fighting for the community. But if we dig deeper, we find another story. We interview women and hear their voices, we find another story. So what is the other story? So the other story is that they actually use these autonomous spaces, the space of this conference, to meet as women and talk about their experiences with Juan Crow, and also to address all of those principles I mentioned, having to do with sexuality, reproductive justice, and a commitment to racial liberation, particularly thinking about Anglo institutions in Latino neighborhoods and whether or not they were actually serving the Latino people. So, a couple of leaders in this movement were Yolanda Garza Birdwell and Gloria Guardiola. Gloria Guardiola was really phenomenal. Unfortunately, it was 2015 she passed, but she had a lot of knowledge, and I was able to interview her before she, made it to the other side. She and Yolanda Birdwell wrote La Mujer, Destrucción de Mitos, Formation y Práctica del Pensamiento Libre, The Woman, Destruction of Myths, Formation and Practice of Free Thinking. They didn't just do this on their own, they also had help of their male counterparts. So on the image in the front, you can see there's like a revolutionary woman, there's a younger woman, and in the middle is a grandmother, abuela. And so a man actually drew this, Leo Tanguma, which if you know about that whole canal mural and the renovation of it, that's the same artist. But he helped them to make this image for this booklet that they created. And how did they create this booklet? They interviewed several women, so these are their first oral historians for this, right? They interviewed several women in the near North Side neighborhood to get their perspectives and come up with this book. So, they brought this book to a talk they did. And in the talk, they advocated for the Hanas to be mentally, physically, and spiritually liberated. Yolanda Garza Birdwell was convinced that a woman had to treat her body as a temple, and that if the Hanas allow someone to have sex, that's fine, but not without her consent. So taking sex seriously. She also has support of her fellow male counterparts, or the male activists in her organization, as I mentioned. So you had people like Alex Rodriguez, who, when I talked to him, said that women held up half the sky, and that the Hanos could not talk about the liberation of our people without saying that without women there would be no people. So once again, they had a lot of allies. They had support in their movement for their beliefs, what they were doing. But some men did not necessarily support the women. So from Maria Jimenez's perspective, some of the men tended to look at women and say, is she a virgin? Is she that immaculate woman, or is she not? If she's more of a virgin, I'll respect her. But if she's not, I'm not going to necessarily respect her. It's true, though. So, Maria Jimenez's advice to a lot of the women around her was, quote, if you want the men to pay attention to you, don't sleep with them, end quote. Of course, that was more complicated because obviously people got together in the movement, right? They had kids and the whole 9 yards. But the reality is that she wanted women to honor themselves and to be very thoughtful about the interactions that they had with other people. So, in this counterpublic of this conference, women are deciding how to deal with sexuality, how to deal with the issues they had, discrimination, sexual discrimination within and outside the Chicano movement on their own terms. They also address this other issue called reproductive justice. Does anybody know what I mean when I say reproductive justice? Yes, sir.
kids or like abortion?
Normally we think of that, right? We think it, right, normally think abortions. Well, the Hanas had a complicated view about that because of this right here, this flyer I have up here, or this image rather. It says, "In forced sterilizations." So what Chicanas and the Hanas knew in particular was there was a whole campaign up until the 70s in Los Angeles County and other places where they were, because of language barriers, because of women being in duress, getting them to sign paperwork that said that they could have their tubes tied. In other words, preventing them from having any more children. This was a campaign of forced sterilization under the idea that Mexican women were breeders and they bred too much. So, the Hanas and Chicanas knew about that. So their approach to birth control and to all of that is going to be a little bit different. A lot of Native American women throughout the United States also faced forced sterilization. They were also put in a very similar situation. So for Irma Mareras, she said, "I remember my mom suffered and worried about having one child after another, and I knew there had to be something else to all of this. By that time, the pill had come out, and I knew some of my friends were taking the pill, but I thought it was their right. If a man can be free to do whatever, so should a woman. And like that, she can do whatever she wants to do. At that time, I was fine with reproductive rights in regards to a woman taking a pill and having her own rights." For a lot of women, like I said, abortion was a touchy subject, but they still believe that having children, or when you have children, should be up to the woman. Yeah, it's still a touchy subject, by the way. That's true. So, I mentioned earlier at the beginning that there was this huge walkout. 150 people walked out on the last day. And a lot of people, a lot of historians, a lot of other scholars have tried to dissect this and ask why. Why did these women walk out? Well, my argument is they walked out because it was held at the WYCA. This was an Anglo institution in a Latino, at the time a Mexican American neighborhood, and they didn't feel that they were meeting their needs. They were really about a time where they wanted their own people to control their own institutions. If you're going to have a community space, why can't we have Latinos in charge of it? So, at this time, the walkout for me is really about racial liberation. All of the women who were Tejanas that walked out didn't give up on gender equality. All of them remained committed to fighting for gender equality, particularly in La Raza Unida Party, which happens after this conference. So all of those people remain committed. So if they remain committed, it's not about them walking out because women's issues were being addressed. So there was a perception among the conference organizers being Elma Barrera and Lucy Moreno. Whether or not it was true, there's a perception that they were middle-class women. Maria Jimenez recalls that as middle-class women, the perception, they, quote, failed to realize that most of the community work had been done down in the barrio with working-class families and working-class women. This was, once again, the perception. Now, Emma Barrera will tell you a different story, which is we came from the barrio, and we were still involved in it. But once again, people felt that them organizing a conference in this space and the way they did it was not really working with the working class people. So, there was a long history of women addressing issues within the YWCA. There's an old organization which you can find more information about at the Houston Metropolitan Research Center, which is downtown. It's the special archives of the Houston Public Library. I recommend everybody go there. They have some really incredible stuff. But in there, it's called El Club Femenino Chapultepec. So there was a women's club. Mostly, these were like women of class, some social standards, right? And they were coming together to do things as women. And eventually they wanted to address the issue going on with their people. So they wrote a whole letter. And in this letter, they addressed a number of things. Why is it that Mexicans only have certain jobs? Why is it that there's all this violence against our people? Why is it that we can only live in certain neighborhoods? By a show of hands, how many of y'all think that the YWCA received that letter well, thought it was a great job? They did not. Y'all right. They thought they should not be speaking out, that they should keep their activities to social, to organizing dances and doing things like that, but not address these larger community issues. But in that same vein, these women in the 60s and 70s are carrying that same torch, addressing the issues that need to be addressed. And so, as that, Maria Jimenez particularly, for her, says, quote, Mayo and La Raza Unida Party was about community control. So here we have YWCA convening a conference. It was not controlled by the community, but an exterior force, and there was a committee of Latinas that organized the conference, but from our perspective, it was still an Anglo institution convening us. So what's going on at this time? Well, what a lot of people don't know is that right at this time, there was a takeover of a church in the near north side. It was the Juan Marcos Presbyterian Church. Why did they take over that church? One, it was neglected, and they asked for it originally, but then the conversations went sour, let's just say that. So they found an innovative way to get in there, which I'll let y'all know what that was. Essentially, they broke a window, they had a little child go in, she opened the door, and they said, well, it was open. And then they occupied the space. But they took over it, and they made it the North Side People's Center. Why do I mention this? Right at this time, people are not wanting spaces in their community to not be used. They want all those spaces to be used and to be controlled by themselves. That's why they took over this church. And this was happening throughout the nation. My colleague, Felipe Hinojosa, has a whole book that he's writing about this movement to address religious connections to the community. So, this is what Yolanda Garders of Birdwell said when they decided to occupy the church. She said, quote, Mayo will take appropriate action to ensure the interests of the community are not neglected. Every day a decision is delayed, a north side resident goes hungry or is pushed out of school. We can wait no longer. The time to act is now. So for Maria Jimenez, in looking at the conference, she says, part of it was because for us, who were active in the Chicano movement, we had challenged institutions. Barrio Mayo had taken over the Presbyterian Church, challenging the control of an Anglo institution. What I remember about those of us who walked out, it was about working class position that respected community control. So, once again, the conference has usually been painted as this great time, this great opportunity to bring women together, but it was a failed effort. I would argue it wasn't failed, because women continue to be involved afterwards. Secondly, the argument was everybody who walked out was all of those people who were upset with the women's issues being addressed. Once again, not reflective in all of the stories and all of the personal testimonies that I've heard. And lastly, what is not really seriously considered, except for with the exception of Maylee Blackwell and a couple of others that are historians, is that women walked out because, in fact, they had an issue with who was putting them together and what that space was about. So, conference spaces were important for these autonomous zones were important for defining what feminism was for people. But one last thing I want to address is the intergenerational and multi-directional feminism. That's a mouthful, but it's important. So in 1975, there was a Chicana Identity Conference at the University of Houston put on by Mujeres Unidas. These were like the next generation of women who came after that 71 conference. And so they wanted to bring together all of these women that had been veteranos or like seasoned people in the movement, along with the new people, and put them all in one space and talk about these issues. Particularly interested in politics, labor, history, bilingual education, which, by the way, you couldn't speak Spanish in school. And when I say speak Spanish in school back then, I'm talking about not in class where you're interrupting. I'm talking about on the playground. I'm talking about in all spaces at school you could not speak Spanish for fear of punishment or expulsion. So that's the atmosphere they grew up in. That's why bilingual education mattered to them. In addition to that, they also wanted to talk about the greater community, La Familia. So, how was this important? How was this empowering to all the women in these spaces? They're addressing some of the same issues, kind of. I only talked about one aspect of the conference in terms of sexual liberation, but there were other issues addressed in that conference. And some of these are some of the same issues. So what exactly makes this conference important to note? What's important is that a lot of these women are coming together in both generations doing work at the same time. Because there's this belief that, oh, there's only one generation. It's the old generation the youth are rebelling against. They never work together in the same spaces. Everything is all separate. And that's not really how the Chicano movement operated, particularly in Texas. So, what are they doing? Well, the person who organized it, a major player, Luis Vallejo, she was a part of Mujeres Unidas. She was a chairperson, and she said, I went to the conference at the Y. So she remembers going as a high school youth to the conference at the Y. I got to see Garza Birdwell speak. I was in high school, and she made a very big impact on me. There were so few Latinas that were invisible, that were in leadership. When you saw somebody like that had magnetism that she had, speaking to you about important issues that were important to you, it made a big impact upon you. So, Maria Jimenez was also equally inspired. This last one. She also thought that everybody coming there was what she called Inez Hernandez Tovar was older. She had been married and divorced and was back in school getting her doctorate. She inspired us and was quite an intellectual. Also, younger women like Cynthia Perez were inspirational. I don't think I could say I looked up to anybody because it was more about what we gained together in our interactions. So intergenerational, bringing those women together in the same space to discuss issues across generations. And Ime Moreles, she actually got the interest of somebody who's the mother of someone running for president now, Rosie Castro. Rosie Castro is the mother of Juan Castro, right? Julio, what is it, Juan? Julian, right? Sorry. Julian Castro. She has two sons, they're twins. One has been in the Senate for a long time. One had a appointment by Obama. But Julian, right? Julian Castro is actually running for president. His mom, they got a lot of inspiration. They don't always talk about it in the news media, but they got all of their political genesis from not only their father, but particularly their mother. Their mother was a main inspiration in their lives. So, what did she say? She said about Ime Moreles, many of the women that I worked with were strong women, including Irma, who was always very active in the state, as well as the local La Raza Unida party. So once again, you're having a multi-directional feminism going on too. You're not just having it where the old people are teaching the young people how to do things, but you have it to where the young people are influencing those older generations. So what are some takeaways from what I'm discussing? I'm sorry, I didn't pull that one up. Okay. So, oral history, if you ever engage in oral history, it's important to remember it's a collaborative process. It's not just about you getting information from the community, but also trying to serve the community in some way. At the very least, allowing them access to those archives and to use those stories as they want to. Many of them want to keep them for their own family members, right? Because those are their stories. The other thing is that oral history functions as a testimonial, as a way of speaking out about race and gender liberation in an environment that wasn't so friendly to Mexican Americans. Also, the Hanas are early intersectional feminists. Now, this is a big term now, right? Intersectionality. Thinking about feminism as not just thinking about being a woman, but also as a Mexican American, also as someone who grew up poor. That's intersectional feminism, right? These are early people in the 60s and 70s doing that, not willing to abandon their commitment to the community while fighting for their own rights. Also, and so it's kind of typified in that collective freedom of all community members. Also, counterpublics are autonomous zones such as the conference and the later conference I discussed are spaces where women were able to discuss their issues and kind of get an idea of what feminism meant to them. What were those points that they came up with that I discussed? Sexual freedom, reproductive justice, race liberation, cross-generational, and multi-directional women's empowerment.